what we started last time on the Holy Land, as it is called, the Holy Land in prophecy, meaning what is today called Palestine. But in the Bible, it's simply the land promised to Abraham. So the Promised Land, or the Holy Land in prophecy, part 2. And I'd like to begin by clarifying something that I brought up last time, since there were questions asked about it. And that is the statement that I made regarding the distinction between the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant, also known as the Mosaic covenant or simply Old Covenant. And there is a distinction between the two. But first of all, in explaining that, I'd like to ask, what is a covenant? I think that's the key to understanding. What is a covenant? You may think of it as simply a contract where two people agree, or two parties agree to certain terms, and maybe there's a little negotiation that takes place and so on. They finally come to an agreement. But in the Bible, well, that's partly true, but not the whole truth. A covenant is an arrangement based on a promise or an oath. And sometimes it's one way. Most of the time it is. It's not an agreement that we come to, you do this and I'll do that and so on. It's a covenant for example, a covenant that God made with creation after the flood was, which was signed by, the sign of the covenant was the rainbow, was his solemn promise to never again destroy the world with the flood of water. That was the covenant. It's called a covenant. Now, there's no conditions attached to that. That's just God's promise. So a covenant then is an arrangement based on a promise or an oath. An agreement, not merely an agreement that God will uphold his end of the bargain if you uphold yours. There's more to it than that. But there are different covenants that have different terms attached to them. So last time I said that, that the Abrahamic covenant is not the same as the Sinai covenant, and that the former, unlike the latter, is unconditional. Now, what did I mean by that? That was the part that was questioned. I said Abrahamic covenant is unconditional, the Sinai covenant is not. And what I meant by that, well, let's read from Deuteronomy chapter 5 to see what Moses says about the covenant that he and the children of Israel had just entered into, or were entering into at that point. It says, "The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb, not with our fathers," not with our fathers. He did not make, not with our fathers, meaning Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the sons of Jacob. "Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today." So he made it with them, not with the fathers before them. Okay, so the Sinai covenant is different from the Abrahamic covenant. So, but yet, at the same time, as I pointed out last time, the Abrahamic covenant is foundational to the Sinai covenant, as it is also foundational to the Davidic covenant, as well as the new covenant described in Jeremiah chapter 31. So you have that basic covenant, that promise, that oath God gave to Abraham, that is unconditional, and it's the foundation, the basis upon which the Sinai covenant that came later was built, also upon which the Davidic covenant was established, and upon which the new covenant is finally established. So it's conditional. It's conditional in this sense. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13, talking about the Sinai covenant being conditional, and in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13, it says this, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. He just has quoted Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. That means it is conditional. It's not unconditional like the Abrahamic covenant. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. You cannot say that about the Abrahamic covenant. You can say it about the Sinai covenant. It is clear then that the Sinai covenant is conditional because it can become obsolete, grow old, vanish away, and so on, and be replaced by a different covenant. But the divine oath, that is to say, the covenant, known as the Abrahamic covenant, upon which the Old Covenant or Sinai covenant was founded, cannot become obsolete or vanish away meaning that the sinfulness of the children of Israel under the Sinai covenant, the sinfulness of the children of Israel could not result in the abolishment of the Abrahamic covenant. You follow that? It's very clear, isn't it? The Apostle Paul says the same thing. We read it last week, or not last week, but last time I was here. So in that sense, the Abrahamic covenant is certainly an unconditional covenant. So that's what I mean. It means that one that simply the sinfulness of human beings cannot cause God to go back on what He has sworn that He will do. That's the point. That's the point I was trying to make, even though I might not have made that clearly. It was clear to me, but perhaps not clear to everyone who heard me. Now, the new covenant of Jeremiah 31 is not, I want to clarify this as well, it is not completely discontinuous with the Old Covenant. We think Old Covenant, obsolete, abolished, done away. New Covenant, something brand new, totally different. No, there's continuity as well as some discontinuity between the two. You can think of it as a contract. Think of this as a contract. Think of it this way. This analogy should help you understand it. Suppose you are the author of a contractual arrangement you and another party enter into together. One party may violate the terms of the contract. In other words, he does not do what he has agreed to do. And this may result in the contract being made null and void. That happens in the world today, of course. Now, once that happens, the contract can be renewed. But the renewal of the contract can also have additional features to assure that the same thing doesn't occur again. The same problem doesn't arise again, causing a cancellation of the contract. Do you understand what I'm driving at here? So it is with the Old and New Covenant. You know, in Jeremiah 31, he says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Same people he made the covenant with. He makes a new covenant with them. And really what this means, and I think most commentaries, especially Old Testament scholars, recognize this, is he's saying, I will renew the covenant. It is a renewed covenant. It is different because it does have new features. Jeremiah 31 tells you what that is, what the new features are. He said, I will write my law in their heart, not just externally on stone, but this time it's going to involve, if you put this together with what Isaiah, Ezekiel, and others say, it involves the Spirit of God at work in the hearts and lives and minds of the people with whom He makes the covenant. So now then it's an internalized law, and this assures then that what He seeks for the house of Israel, the house of Judah, will be fulfilled by them. Okay, so is anything unclear about that? Just wanted to clarify some things since I apparently wasn't that clear last time. So now, with all that hopefully cleared up, let's continue with the subject indicated by the title of the sermon. Part 2, the Holy Land and Prophecy. And I want to go to the book of Zechariah. We could go to many books. We could spend hours and hours on this subject, going through Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all the other prophets. But Zechariah has a couple of chapters here, 2 or 3 chapters, that nicely sums up everything. So I want to focus on it because it speaks of Israel in the latter days, and it is actually referring to Jerusalem and Judea. That's what it's referring to, refers to as Israel. In this case, it's not talking about the northern house of Israel. It's just talking about the inhabitants of the land, including the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judea. These are Jews, in other words. And it's clearly about the last days. Now, the prophet Zechariah was a 6th century BC contemporary of the prophet Haggai. The Jews had returned to the Promised Land. To give you a little context, they'd already come back to that land, again today called Palestine, also known as the Holy Land, and had begun to rebuild the temple. But there were many troubles, internal troubles, external troubles. We won't go through all of that, but all kinds of troubles came along, and so the building of the temple was left off. The people were kind of stagnant. They were not going anyplace. They were not doing anything. They needed repentance. They needed to get back to God. They were beginning to drift again. All kinds of problems that emerged. So this is why Haggai and Zechariah came on the scene. And they began to encourage the people to get on with their God-ordained responsibilities, build the temple, and so on. But then you come to the latter half of the book of Zechariah, the latter portion of the book, and this is, many of the scholars today think, and I think they're wrong, but they think that this was written by somebody else much later. No, I think it's the same prophet, Zechariah. He may have written it later in life, but nevertheless, it's the same prophet. It has certain features, and I'm not going to get into all that. There's certain features to indicate that, and no good reason to think it was not Zechariah who actually wrote it. But that's the way it is with the higher critics today. They want to, divide up the Bible, say, well, he didn't. This author who claims to have written this didn't really write it. Blah blah blah. And it goes. You've heard it all. But I believe Zechariah did write it. But the latter part is made up of two oracles, both of which pertain to the ultimate outcome, which is the future establishment of God's kingdom upon this earth. Now let me explain to you something about how prophecy works. If you start reading the book of Zechariah, or Haggai for that matter, you will see very clearly that they are dealing with issues, problems, and so on that pertain to the people living right then and right there in that land. And they're both saying that this is your problem, this is what you need to do about it, and this is what's going to happen if you'll do this and this, or if you don't do this and this. This is what will happen in the days, the weeks, the months, and the years immediately ahead of you. But in the midst of all of this, and this is common in the prophetic writings, you see it everywhere in the prophetic writings. In the midst of this descriptions of the immediate problems and the immediate days ahead, you have imagery, word images, and descriptions of the distant future, of the ultimate outcome of things. That's just the way it is. You can go through the prophets, you see that over and over again. The ultimate outcome. And when you get to chapters 12 through 14, in the book of Zechariah, you see the ultimate outcome of it all being described. So for those who say that these oracles of chapters 9 through 14, actually chapter 9, but I'm going to focus on 12 through 14, but I won't read every verse in those, but 9 through 14, the latter part of Zechariah, those who say that was already fulfilled in ancient history, no, all I can say is no, it wasn't. It wasn't. And as we read this, you're going to see it wasn't. Here Zechariah is talking about ultimate outcomes in contrast to the problems you presently face. And sometimes these ultimate outcomes pertain to something to take place centuries or even millennia later. And I say to you that today we have not yet seen these ultimate outcomes, but they do lie ahead. And perhaps, I have to say perhaps, I don't know for sure, what we see going on in that land today is related to what we see described in these last chapters of the book of Zechariah. So, with all of that being stated, let's go to chapter 12. Chapter 12, this is where you find these two oracles. Actually, this is where you find chapters 12 through 14 is where you find the latter of the two oracles in this latter portion of the book of Zechariah. So chapter 12, we'll just begin there in verse 1 and read our way through it, and I'll comment along the way. It says, the burden of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Now, who is Israel here? Well, we'll read further and you'll see who he has in mind. Again, this is not, as in many of the other prophets, when it says Israel is referring to the northern kingdom. In this case, it is not. It's just the people in the land at the time, including in Jerusalem and in Judea. He says, thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. What does he mean by that? Strange language to us. But what does he mean? Obviously, this is what he means. He means he compares Jerusalem to the cup that everybody wants to take a sip out of. And all the surrounding peoples, they're gathered together. I want some of what they've got. I'm going to go and sip out of that cup. And it's going to make them staggered, enough to fall again. But they'll be staggering drunk as a result of sipping from this cup. So God is saying, I'm going to step in now. I'm going to take action. And when they start sipping from the cup, as so to speak, then they will stagger, be drunk out of their heads. And then he uses some other choice descriptions here. He says, the siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. In other words, the people of Judea, the Jews in the land. And what does this tell us? This, again, I'm telling you, this is talking about the latter days, the very end of the matter. And as I said in part one, I do not believe that the prophecies about the Great Restoration have taken place. I do not believe that the 1948 event was the fulfillment of the Great Restoration prophecies. That comes later. That comes after the second coming of Christ. But what this tells us is that the Jews will be in the land, in Jerusalem, in Judea, in the time of the end. And as you're going to see, God is going to defend them. On that day, verse 3, on that day I will make Jerusalem, here's another description, choice description. I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves. You ever had back problems from lifting something heavy? Everybody's experienced that, so you know what this is saying. Everybody that tries to lift this stone, they're going to go away going, oh, they're going to be in pain. Everybody that tries to lift it, they will be hurt. It says, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. So here they come. They're going to lift this stone. I can't imagine all the nations of the earth being against Jerusalem. Can you? Now, everybody loves Jerusalem, don't they? I'm being facetious, of course. The United Nations, they're just pro-Israel all the way around, aren't they? Don't all the surrounding nations, don't they all just love Israel and want Israel to prosper and be healthy and prosper as a nation? I don't think so. So here we're told that all nations are going to try to lift this heavy stone and are going to get hurt by it. It says, on that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic, and its rider with madness. And for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts their God. They're going to begin to recognize where their strength is coming from. On that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. In other words, they're going to do some major damage. And they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem. And the Lord will give salvation to the tents of Judah first, and the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass all that. This is the ultimate outcome here, but listen to these next words here. On that day, the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem so that the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. In other words, what this is saying is God will be with them, God will be protecting them, God will be guiding them, God will be fighting for them, as it were. Oh, they'll be in battle, all right, but God is on their side. That's what this is telling us. And on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. So it's not a good idea to be among those who want to come against Jerusalem, I would say. Because as we read last time, the promises God has given, those Abrahamic promises included, are irrevocable. He gave the people the land, and He has not revoked that. You cannot cancel that just because He allowed all kinds of calamity to come upon them because of covenant breaking. Nevertheless, His basic promise, His promise to Abraham and the offspring coming from Abraham And the Apostle Paul makes it clear, the unbelieving among Abraham's offspring, his children, are still beloved of God. Even though they become enemies of the church, enemies of Christ, enemies, your enemies, for Christ's sake, because they didn't receive Christ. But Paul was talking about the Jews of his time. But then nevertheless, they're beloved for the sake of the fathers. That means that Paul has in view that covenant that God made with Abraham that is irrevocable. And so, do they still have a right to that land? I say, yeah. They never did lose the right to the land. They might have been driven out of it, but that doesn't mean that God was suspended then or revoked his promise to Abraham. No. Some people think, well, he did until he brings them back. No, he never did. He never did say you can't dwell there. The fact is, there was always a Jewish presence in the land. Always. Even during the exiles, there was still a Jewish presence there. When they were driven out by the Romans, AD 70, there was still a Jewish presence there. When they were driven out again by the Romans, said, don't come back this time, get out of here and stay away. And the Romans changed the name of the place to Palestinia or something like that, where Palestine comes from, named after the Philistines, because the Romans recognized that was the enemies of Israel. So we'll give it a different name to keep them out of here. They were still there. They were still there. Have been there the whole time. God never told them they couldn't live there. Never told them they couldn't. He gave it to them and never told them they could not live there any longer. It's just that it's because of their breaking of His covenant, because of their lawlessness, their sinfulness, that they brought all kinds of problems upon themselves. And God allowed their enemies to overtake them. But nevertheless, this brings us to the time of the end. We see very clearly here that there will still be a Jewish presence in the land, and it's even called Israel here. Even called Israel. So on that day, verse 9 again, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now then, let me pause here to say this. We have been reading about Jerusalem and the people that dwell there physically, talking about an actual physical war going on, and God delivering them, God protecting them, and so on. Here now we're going into a spiritual aspect. This is what else is going to happen in that day. Something very exciting. To me, it's very exciting. Notice what it is here in verse 10, and I will pour out. Now this, I say this is before the second coming. Before the second coming. We're going to see the second coming takes place a little later. But this is the time leading up to the second coming of Christ, at a time when Israel is at war. It says, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they will mourn for him. They will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child and weeps bitterly over him, as one weeps over a firstborn. You know what this is referring to? The pierced one, it's the Messiah. They're going to, at long last, during this period, recognize him as their Messiah. He really is. He is the Messiah they're going to finally see. You know, you have a growing number of Jews today that are messianic. They believe that Yeshua is the true Messiah. And you have a movement even inside of Jerusalem today that recognizes Yeshua as the Messiah. This tells us that there's going to be an awakening there. There's going to be an awakening in the midst of all this battle, all this turmoil, all the problems that are taking place when the nations come against Jerusalem. There's going to be an awakening there. They're going to finally, at long last, begin to recognize it. Now look at, hold your place there. I'll go just read it to you. I'll turn there and read it to you in Romans chapter 11 to remind you what we read last time. It says, the Apostle Paul says, lest you be wise in your own conceits, verse 25, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and so forth. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The Gentiles meaning the nations. The nations have come against Jerusalem. And now here we have, what we're reading about here is the fullness of the Gentiles is now coming to an end. It's coming to an end, and now you see Israel, many within right there in the land itself, converting, recognizing Yeshua as the Messiah. Verse 11, on that day, well, we don't need to read further. It goes on to describe the same thing, but let's move on over. A lot of additional description here is about what God will do about the remnant. It concerns cutting off of idolatry and all kinds of things, the positive results of what's about to happen here, what is happening as a result of this spiritual awakening. Now let's move on to chapter 14. Chapter 14. It says, behold, a day is coming, and he's talking about the same thing. A day is coming when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken and houses plundered. This will what will happen when these nations come against Jerusalem. Houses plundered, and the women raped. Can you imagine anything like that happening today in that land? Well, yeah, I think you can. You look around, look at recent events. It sounds like it's describing recent events, doesn't it? Although it's not Jerusalem, it's outside Jerusalem. Nevertheless, this is what certain enemies would like to do to Jerusalem and all Judea. He said, and he goes on to say, half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. In other words, they're going to be in the city. Some will go to exile, but many others will stay right there in the city. Now, in other words, the impression you get is they're trapped. They're under siege. They're trapped in the city. While some have been taken away in exile, others are trapped in the city. In other words, it's like the recent thing we saw but this time on steroids. This time it's more extensive. But then this is what happens as a result of that. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of battle. The day of battle, that refers to the times in the past when there have been days of the Lord. There have been many days of the Lord, as it were. But it means simply that times when God has intervened and fought for his people. One good example of that is when the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea. What happened to the pursuing Egyptians? God fought in his day of battle, and he destroyed the Egyptian army. So this is what this is referring to. In the same way, God is going to fight for Jerusalem in that day. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. And then remember what we read about back in verse 2, half the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. They're going to be in the city, but now when God acts, when the mount is split in two, it provides a way of exit, a way for them to escape. Notice what it says. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So there's a way of escape. God himself causes it. He doesn't part the Red Sea, he parts the Mount of Olives, and they flee through it. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Now, here it talks about God, the Lord God, Yahweh, acting in the history of this people. And again, this is future. Well, what we need to understand is how God acts. A lot of people, I've heard somebody once said, well, this is God the Father, because it says Yahweh. This must be God the Father. But you remember that back in the time of Abraham, we find Yahweh on earth conversing with Abraham as he was making his way or about to leave and go towards Sodom. And he talks with Abraham for a while. When he goes his way, it says, and then Yahweh rained fire from heaven, from Yahweh out in heaven. Have a visible Yahweh on earth and an invisible Yahweh in heaven. What does that tell you? That there Yahweh in heaven has an agent who also goes by the name Yahweh. So which one is it talking about here? You have two here who are in Scripture, and even the messenger of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh is sometimes called Yahweh because he is God's agent. And we've gone into this before, I'm not going to take time to elaborate on it here. He is not functionally equal to the Father, but he is ontologically equal to the Father. That's why he can be called Yahweh, the same name that the Father is called. So I would say, my view is different from the friend of mine who told me that this must be God the Father. No, I said this is the Father acting through in the person of the Son, the one who became Jesus Christ. He's the one who comes down visibly, because this is, as we're going to see here, this talks about a visible manifestation. So it says, then the Lord God will come and the Holy Ones with him. Now then comes, he takes it on out to the ultimate. This is the aftermath, and then he'll come back to the subject, the war that's going on at the time. In the next few verses he says, this sounds very familiar, sounds like it's something that comes out of Revelation. Actually, Revelation draws from this. It says, on that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at the evening time there shall be light. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem. And what this is talking about is the ultimate renewal and glorification of Jerusalem. It is now the new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. And you see this described in Revelation chapter 21. Half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, will be seen as one, is what it means. And his name one. There'll be no more idols in the land, no more worship of the Baals and the other gods, the false gods, and so on. So throughout all the earth, it says, the Lord will be, what this is saying, it'll be, God will be worshipped. Okay, let's skip on down now. He goes on to describe this in further detail, but in verse 12, let's move, he goes back to the subject. In verse 12 it said, and this shall be the plague. This is back to the war that begins all of this. Before this situation, the New Jerusalem and so on. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Sounds like a pretty macabre scene, doesn't it? This is what they have to look forward to. Now, well, let's go on and read a little further here. It says, and on that day a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of one will raise against the hand of another. Even Judah will fight. This translation said will fight against Jerusalem. It means he'll fight at Jerusalem to defend Jerusalem. So this is the war that's taking place right at the very time of the end, when God does finally intervene and the Messiah appears. And the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance, and a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. Then, in other words, after all of this is accomplished, once the battle is won, then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem, guess what's going to happen to them? Are they going to go back to their old religions, their old idolatries? Are the Muslims going to go back to worshiping Allah and saying Muhammad is his only prophet? Is that what's going to happen? Notice what happens after that. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year. This has not been, I was told one time by someone who wanted to debate the topic, said, oh, everybody knows this was fulfilled in ancient times, back when such and such took place. He plugged it into some ancient time. But anyway, no, it's not. There's never been a time when the remnant of those who came against Jerusalem went up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. That's never happened. When did that happen? Oh yeah, it happened long ago. And the person was arguing that you can't show me one scripture where it says Gentiles are ever commanded to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Yeah, I can. Right here it is. They shall go up from year after, it said year after year, not one time, not a brief period of time, year after year, to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And if any of the family, and it doesn't mean every person, it means representatives of those nations. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. In other words, they're not going to have economic success. And if the family of Egypt, predominantly Muslim Egypt, if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now what is this telling us? This tells us that there will be a Jewish presence, a very strong Jewish presence, in the land of promise in the time of the end. It's even called Israel here, and that God is going to defend at some point in time, what point I can't tell you, but at a certain point in time when the nations are warring against Judea and against Jerusalem, when they're trying to sip from that cup or lift that heavy stone, then God is going to intervene. He's going to intervene. And He's going to bring about all of these things that are described here. They will go up from year to year to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. The nations round about will do that. In other words, it's not going to be that they're going to drive Israel out. No, they're not going to do that. They're not going to drive the people out of the land that God said that was theirs. Instead, what's going to happen is that they're going to come to the land and worship their God. It's not going to be some false god. It's not going to be Allah. They're not going to Mecca. They're going to Jerusalem to worship the true God and keep the Feast of Tabernacles of all things. Can you imagine keeping a Jewish feast? These people who so hate the Jews, or the way they see it's a Jewish feast. But in any case, that's what you have going on here. Now, with all that in mind, this is Israel in prophecy. And I'm talking about the modern nation of Israel. It will result in all of this. When, I don't know. Maybe after my lifetime. I just don't know. Just don't know. But let's tie this in with some other scriptures. You remember in Matthew chapter 23, we've talked about this before, and how I have said that it's very important to realize that Jesus is not only in the Olivet prophecy, He's not only talking about things that are future, He is definitely talking about future things, but He's also talking about things that would take place within the generation of the apostles during that time. Things that would befall Jerusalem that would have an effect on and would be in some way connected with the very time of the end when Christ would return. So let's read this one verse here. Verse 37 of Matthew chapter 23 says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. You were not willing. That's what it means. He says, see, your house is left to you desolate. Now, which Jerusalem is he talking about? Some future Jerusalem? Or the Jerusalem right then and there that was, whose citizens, or at least some of its citizens, were about to put him to death? He's talking about that Jerusalem, then and there. Your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, now this is a key verse right here. I tell you, you will not see me again until, we read about this in Zechariah's prophecy, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Remember what Zechariah said? When they see the one that they had pierced, their response to it, when they finally come to this recognition that he is in fact the Messiah, and therefore they'll be prepared and be ready, and they will be saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh, of Hashem, whatever name they're using in Jerusalem at that time. So this is the consistent, what Jesus says here is consistent with what we see in Zechariah. Now he goes on to describe the horrendous tribulation that would befall the city of Jerusalem, and it did befall the city of Jerusalem. The city was besieged. If you read Josephus' account, you see how horrible it was. The city was besieged to the point where people were starving because their food supplies ran out. They were starving, and cannibalism was taking place and that sort of thing. It was horrible, horrible. And then they came in finally, and the temple was destroyed just as Jesus said it would be. People are looking for remarkable, amazing prophecies, fulfilled prophecies to prove the Bible. This is one that's often overlooked. Now you say, wait a minute, I thought this was about the end time. Well, it is, but let's understand something. There is something that connects the AD 70 event when the temple was destroyed. There is something here in the Olivet prophecy that connects that with what we just read in Zechariah, the time of the end. And that is the time of the Gentiles. It says Jerusalem, from this time, meaning from this very time here, when the temple is destroyed, and remember, this Jerusalem was central to the worship of the people. Central, because that's where the temple was. That's where God's special presence was. That's where they would come through to in the pilgrimage festivals and worship God there. But now the temple gone, and it says Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. In other words, the nations are going to trample Jerusalem underfoot. Has that happened? Oh yeah, yeah. So in that sense, from the tribulation of AD 70 until the present, Jerusalem has been trodden underfoot by the Gentiles. Even though there's a Jewish presence there, rest assured that it's still being, in some measure, trodden underfoot by the Gentiles. There's still no peace in that land. So what will end that is when Christ returns, when that final day of the Lord begins. And when he comes, then we read what will happen there in Zechariah's prophecy. Then there will be a remnant who will escape, a remnant who will convert. I don't know how many that means, but apparently a fairly significant number who will recognize Jesus as the Messiah, be prepared for his coming when he does appear. And when he does appear, they will rejoice. They will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then let's go finally to Revelation chapter 19. We have a description of that day. It's put in different terms. The same thing described in Zechariah 14, the same thing Christ is alluding to in the Olivet prophecy, but it's in Revelation chapter 19. Now the book of Revelation focuses more on the powers of the world against the church. Satan against Christ and his church, more so than Israel. Nevertheless, these things are consistent with one another. What we see in Zechariah is consistent with what we see in the book of Revelation. And this also pertains to Israel. After all, there will be a remnant to be converted out of Israel. I'm talking about the land over there in the time of the end. And they will be defended, will be protected when the Mount of Olives splits and they flee and so on. But in any case, we read this in Revelation chapter 19, verse 11. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God, the Logos of God. It's clear who he's talking about here, isn't it? It's Jesus Christ. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in white linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth goes a sharp sword with which to strike the nations. And that's what we read again in Zechariah 14. He's about to strike the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. That's when he tells them, say, you'll come up to the Feast of Tabernacles, or you will be cursed as a result of not coming up. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. You know, this is, you try to picture this scene here, and it is something, it's terrible. It's terrible. And this is that babe away in the manger that we hear so much about at this time of the year. This is him. This is the real Jesus Christ, the one who came into this world, born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth. He's coming back, and this is what he's going to do. This is how he's going to deal with the enemies of God. Now, I say enemies of God because ultimately they are the enemies of God. This is how he's going to deal with those who come against Jerusalem, and also those who will oppose his church and persecute his church. It says, from his mouth goes a sharp sword from which to strike the nations. He will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. You know what this is describing? Winepress. The wicked are thrown into the winepress. Those who oppose God's people, whether Israel or the church, they're going to be thrown into that winepress, and he's going to, you know, the picture is he is treading them. He's crushing them underfoot. That's a very horrible scene when you think about it. Crushing them underfoot, and the blood is gushing out. Terrible scene. But this is what Jesus Christ is going to do. In that day, you know, in that day, indeed, one could sing about Palestine being set free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Yes, it will. You got that right. It will be free. It'll be free of the oppressors of Israel and the church. It'll be free of the evil that presently exists there, the evil that threatens the existence of Israel. And ultimately, the enemy of us all. And I'm not just talking about those, I'm not just singling out those particular people. We see the spirit of Antichrist all throughout the world in various forms. He will deal with all of them. On his robe and on the thigh, he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he's going to show himself to be so. You know, you're looking at the situation today, and you think, oh, what on earth can be done? Just focusing on that one problem in the Middle East. It's been a persistent problem for so long. But when you look at it, you think, okay, they destroy Hamas. Suppose Israel does. That's what they're committed to do, destroy Hamas. We have to remember, though, there's still Hezbollah. There's still these other organizations that exist. What's going to happen then? What's going to happen after that? Is it going to end? I say, no, it's not going to end. Not going to end. It might get a little better for a while. There might be some relief from the rockets being fired into the land for a little while. You might have some of that. Might even find some little bit of sympathy from a few nations, maybe. So there might be relief for a little while, but it's not going to be permanent. It's not going to be permanent because you have too many enemies there. The spirit of Antichrist in various forms is alive and well in this world today. And so there won't be peace until the one who steps in, who shows who the real king is. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Then he's going to make some changes. Then you're going to see, at long last, peace in the Holy Land. And that's what the prophets point to. We understand it as the millennial reign. We'll see peace at long last because the King of Kings is on his throne reigning from Jerusalem. And that's the day we look forward to. And that's the day when that peace will not only be in the land of promise, but will extend to all the families of the earth. Then and only then will we see the fulfillment of the promise, the covenant God made with Abraham.